He paid $3 for the virgin bride but gave her silence, not demand. She was sold for $3, not for love, not for labor, just 3 crumpled bills tossed into the dust enough, apparently, to own a human soul. Everyone expected what always came next. The man would take what he paid for, but instead, he knelt. In silence, he offered no touch, no demands, just space. This isn't a story about romance. It's about what happens when someone refuses to take and chooses, instead, to see. In today's story, you'll meet a woman whose name was forgotten long before the auction began, and a man who didn't rescue her, but gave her the one thing she never thought she deserved, a quiet place to begin again. But when her hidden past appears at their doorstep, a boy no one knew existed, the silence between them will be tested. Will dignity survive when the truth arrives too late? Comment below which moment from this story touched you the most. And if you feel something stir in your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. Now then, let's begin. The Auction of Silence. The wind cut hard across the dirt lot, whipping dust into the air and catching in the folds of her thin dress. She didn't flinch, didn't wipe her eye. She just stood there barefoot on the wooden platform, hands limp at her sides, head bowed, not in submission, but in survival. They called her a virgin bride, said it like a prize, like purity was a currency men could hold and break at will. The crowd didn't bid on her like they wanted her, they bid like they wanted to own something that couldn't look them in the eye. The auctioneer's voice was hoarse from hours of shouting. He slapped his ledger, waved his hand, called for number. Offers flew from the crowd, thick with sweat and jokes, their tones laced with conquest. Then, from the edge, a voice. $3. Laughter followed. "3?" Someone scoffed. "You buying a mule or a wife?" But the man didn't react. He didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, hat in hand. When the gavel fell, no one cheered. He climbed the platform slowly, boots echoing on the dry wood. She didn't move, didn't dare meet his eyes. She braced herself for the hand, the pull, the mark of ownership, but it didn't come. He stood before her, paused, then removed his hat and bowed his head not in dominance, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you, I do not take." Then, with quiet steps, he turned from the platform, and something in her legs, in her breath, in the part of her that had gone numb long ago moved. She followed, not because he led, but because, for the first time, no one else tried to. The cabin that waited. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky still carried its weight thick, pale, and heavy like an old bedsheet pulled over a body no one wanted to bury. There were 2 sets of footprints behind them, one deep and steady, the other light, uncertain, as if her legs hadn't decided whether they were escaping or surrendering. When they reached the cabin, it didn't look like shelter. It looked like someone had built it long ago to be forgotten. The kind of place people passed without noticing, or noticed without stopping. No smoke curled from the chimney. No dog barked. The windows held the frost like memory holds silence. There was no lock on the door. Only a broom standing bristled down beside the frame, a quiet symbol. Not exactly an invitation, not a warning either. Just a way of saying, someone lives here who knows what it means to clean up after things. Someone who doesn't mind footprint. She stepped inside first, not because he told her to. He didn't speak at all. Just opened the door, waited, then followed. The space inside was small, square, and stripped of anything unnecessary. No photos, no trophies, no books, just a table, 2 chairs, a stove that hadn't been lit in days, and a cot in the far corner made with military neatness. He walked past her, removed his coat dark, frayed at the hem, and placed it carefully over the back of a chair. Then he turned and walked right back outside, not even glancing at her. No lingering look, no silent claim, just absence, immediate and complete. Like he'd done this before, like he knew some people need a room to themselves before they remember how to breathe. Anth stood still, arms at her sides, eyes scanning for danger in patterns. There was none. No ropes, no locks, no corners dark enough to hide a man with the wrong kind of need. The stove held a pile of wood ready to burn. She didn't light it. The chill in her bones had nothing to do with temperature. On the table sat a tin box, its lid left ajar. Inside, half a loaf of dry bread wrapped in a piece of muslin. Not fresh, but cared for. Across the room, a ceramic mug sat by the wash basin clean, turned upside down, the kind of cleanliness not for show, but for sanity. Everything about the place felt like it had waited a long time for someone to come ruin it. But nothing here had tried to impress her. That, more than anything, made her knees wobble. She sat in the corner nearest the stove and tucked her knees to her chest. Her palms rested on the floorboards, cold and splintered. And then, only then, did she notice the sound outside. Not footsteps, not movement, just the breath of the wind brushing past the frame. She crawled to the door and peeked through the gap. He was there, seated on the edge of the porch, back straight, boots planted. Snow drifted around him and onto his shoulders, but he didn't shake it off. He let it settle, as if it belonged there, as if stillness was something you had to earn. She watched for a minute, 2, 10, no movement. He wasn't guarding, wasn't sulking. He was simply giving space. And in that space, something inside her shifted. Not enough to trust. Not yet, but just enough to sleep. She pulled the blanket from the cot rough wool, smelling faintly of smoke and pine, and curled on the floor beside the firewood. She didn't light it, didn't need to. For the first time in years, it wasn't the cold she was afraid of. That night, no one came through the door. No voice barked her name. No hand reached for her in the dark. When she woke up, it was morning. The light outside was soft, not blinding. Through the open door frame, she saw the man still seated, still silent. The snow had stopped. His coat was damp with melt, his breath steady. And just like that, something strange bloomed in her chest. Not gratitude, not affection, just a fragile kind of safety, the kind that doesn't ask for proof. This wasn't home. Not yet. But it also wasn't a cage. And for someone who'd spent most of her life being moved, claimed, touched, and traded without permission, this was the first space that didn't want anything back. A place that said, you don't have to speak, you don't have to smile, you can just be. The value of a place like that, where silence isn't punishment, but protection can't be measured in dollars or walls. It's not what the cabin gave her, but what it didn't demand. No explanations, no service, no obedience. For a girl who'd been bought for $3, it was the first time nothing was expected in return. And in that, the healing began. The man who didn't ask. The second morning came quietly. The kind of quiet that didn't press against the walls, but settled into them. Anth opened her eyes slowly, unsure if the stillness meant safety or if danger had simply fallen asleep beside her. The blanket had stayed on all night. Her body didn't ache from curling against a wall, and her wrists bore no fresh bruises. The man, still a stranger to her, in name if not in presence, was already awake. He stood by the counter, slicing something with an old knife. When she shifted, the blade paused, not from fear, but from attention. Then, without turning fully, he said one sentence. There's bread, if you're hungry. Not a demand, not a test. Just a sentence set down like a cup of water there if needed, easy to ignore if not. She didn't answer, didn't reach for the bread. She sat on the edge of the cot, her hands clenched in the fabric of her skirt. Her eyes studied him, waiting for the real thing to start. The part where the rules change. But he didn't ask for anything. That first day passed in fragments. He brought in more firewood. She swept the dust from the corners. No conversation, no boundaries crossed. Only the occasional meeting of eyes, his calm, hers skeptical. She asked nothing. He offered nothing beyond what was visible. Until late that afternoon, as he handed her a small tin cup of warm water, she asked the question that had been clawing inside her since the auction. What do you want from me? He didn't blink, just handed her the cup and walked away. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from confusion. The not knowing pressed harder than any weight she'd felt before. When the world is built on pain, kindness feels like a lie. The next morning, as he was chopping wood outside, she asked again, her voice firmer this time, challenging, "What do you want from me?" He paused only briefly, then went back to chopping. She nearly shouted it that evening, the frustration curling out of her chest like smoke. "What do you want from me?" This time, he looked at her. The fire was low. His face flickered in and out of shadow, but his eyes stayed steady. "Everyone thinks that's what comes first," he said, not unkindly. "The taking, the claiming, the proof that you're his now." She didn't know whether to nod or scream, because yes, that's what came first, always. Even when it didn't come with violence, it came with silence, the kind that took pieces of her without touching skin. And then, just as she felt the tremble begin in her hands, he stood and walked to the door. From behind it, he brought out a broom. He held it in both hands, not offering, not insisting, just holding. She stared at it. "What is this?" she asked, more confused than ever. "Choice," he said. "If you want to do something, you can sweep. If not, you don't have to." She took the broom, not because she wanted to clean, but because it was the first thing anyone had ever given her without expecting anything in return. That day, she swept the cabin slowly, not to please him, not to repay him, just to feel the grain of the floor under her hands, to move her body for her own reason. She didn't say thank you, and he didn't ask for it. But when the dust cleared, and the room held nothing but air between them, she realized something quietly profound. He wasn't trying to rescue her. He was making space for her to rescue herself. And for a woman who had been passed from hand to hand like a coin, that kind of space felt more valuable than gold. A hair braid, a holy moment. The snow returned that morning not with fury, but with the soft persistence of something that didn't need to be noticed to keep falling. It blurred the line between earth and sky, the kind of white that makes the world feel paused, suspended between breaths. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, warm but humble. Anth sat by the hearth, legs curled beneath her hair loose and tangled from too many nights of unrest. She had never cared much for her hair. It had been pulled, cut, grabbed, and ignored by too many hands that didn't belong to her. He was behind her, fixing the hinge on the small cupboard door. Nothing about him moved with urgency. It was a kind of patience she hadn't seen in a man before, not the kind that waited for a chance, but the kind that expected nothing at all. She reached up, pulled her hair over one shoulder absently. And then he asked, not boldly, not with intention, just quietly, "May I braid your hair?" The room didn't answer, neither did she. The question hung there, soft as ash, strange in its simplicity. It didn't make sense. Not in the world she'd known. No man had ever asked to touch her unless he meant to take something. She turned her head slightly, brows furrowed not from anger, but from confusion. "You want to braid it?" He nodded once. "Only if you'd like. My mother used to let me practice on hers." She didn't know why, but she laughed, a breathless, startled laugh, like ice cracking under a sudden beam of sun. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't joy. It was the absurdity of the moment, the fact that someone, anyone, thought her hair was something worth braiding and not branding. And so, without answering, she turned around and faced the fire again. That was permission enough. He came behind her, sat on the stool, and gently gathered her hair in both hands. His fingers were rough from years of work, ropes, reins, winter wood, but his touch was so careful it made her flinch, not in fear, but in memory, not of pain, but of how long it had been since anyone had touched her without asking something in return. He didn't rush. He didn't comment on the softness or the color or the length. He didn't let his hands linger. He simply braided, over and under, over and under. The rhythm of it reminded her of her sister, long ago, on a porch swing in spring, when the world still had flowers and no one was watching. Tears didn't come not yet, but the lump in her throat rose like a warning, not because she felt broken, but because she didn't know healing could come wrapped in silence. When he finished, he tied it with a thread from his coat lining. Still no word. He stood, stepped away, and let her sit there, facing the fire, the braid resting softly against her back like a signature written without ink. But just before he walked outside, he said it. "That," he murmured, "is the first touch that matters. The one that waits." She didn't look at him, but her hands came up, slowly, reverently, to touch the braid, not to check it, to believe it, because for the first time in her life, touch had arrived with no hunger behind it, no price, no pressure. And that kind of touch, a touch that asks nothing, that waits and respects, wasn't just kind, it was sacred. And in that moment, Anth understood something no one had ever told her before. Healing doesn't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it comes braided in silence, one strand at a time. She sat there long after he stepped out, unmoving, afraid that if she so much as shifted, the moment would break. The braid felt too delicate to be real. Not the way it was done, his fingers had been sure, but the meaning behind it, the gentleness threaded between strands. No one had ever left something on her body without trying to own it. It wasn't a braid, it was an offering. And somehow, that made it heavier than chains. Outside, she heard the soft crunch of his boots in the snow, steady, retreating not out of rejection, but respect. That was his rhythm. Give space, step back, wait without wanting. She moved her fingers slowly down the braid. It wasn't perfect, a bit uneven near the end, but it held. And in that imperfection, there was truth. He hadn't done it to impress her. He hadn't done it to impress himself. He'd done it because he saw her, not her body, not her story, not her bruises. Her. The girl who once sat on a windowsill and let the wind pull her hair into knots just for the joy of untangling it. The girl who used to believe touch meant kindness. The woman who now feared it might mean ruin. And now, in this braid, that belief had a chance to be rewritten. Because healing wasn't always a thunderclap of revelation. Sometimes it was one gesture, one pause, one man behind you who didn't speak until after he let go. And when he finally came back inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, he didn't look to see if she was still seated. He didn't ask how she felt. He simply nodded, set another log on the fire, and said, "Soup's warming." And that was all. Because in a world where silence had often meant danger, his silence meant safety. And in that space between his question and her acceptance, something had shifted forever. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of trust. The kind of trust braided from nothing but patience. The fire with a name. The next morning, she rose before him. The cabin was still cloaked in blue light, the kind that comes just before dawn and feels more like memory than morning. Her feet hit the floor without fear. Her breath was steady. Her hands, those same hands that used to shake when reaching for anything, now moved with quiet purpose. She knelt by the hearth, not out of habit, but out of choice. There were logs stacked neatly beside the fireplace, matches tucked in a rusted tin. No one told her to light the fire. No one expected it. But she did it anyway, because to strike that match, to birth that flame meant something now. It meant she had woken by her own will. He came in moments later, still drying his hands on a worn cloth. His hair was damp. His eyes met hers, then dropped to the fire. "You did that?" he asked. She nodded once, a hint of pride slipping through her guarded posture. "It's burning clean," he said, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. She didn't smile. But inside, something glowed brighter than the flame itself. They ate in silence. But this silence was different now, less like a void, more like a shared language. Words weren't needed when the air already knew how to listen. After breakfast, he poured 2 cups of tea and handed her one. Then, as casually as if he were asking about the weather, he said, "Do you have a name?" She looked up sharply, not because it was a strange question, but because no one had asked it that gently before. "I mean," he continued, "one you want to keep." She hesitated. Her real name was buried somewhere in her past, under bruises, under bargains, under the weight of being bought. Every time someone had said it before, it had been followed by orders, or worse, so she shook her head. "No," she whispered. Not really. He didn't ask again. Instead, he turned to the fire, leaned down, and said, "Then we'll start with this." She blinked. "With what?" He nodded toward the flame. "This fire. Let's name it." She stared at him. "You want to name the fire?" He shrugged, sipping his tea. "Seems like it deserves it. It's the first thing you did that was just yours." She looked at the flame, small, steady, warm. "Okay," she said quietly. "What should we call it?" They settled on Mercy, not because the fire was soft, but because it didn't ask for anything to burn except what was offered. After that, everything got a name. The broom became Grace. The chipped cup was Hope. The small chair near the window where she liked to sit when the sun touched the wood was Return. It was silly, childish maybe, but each name was a thread, stitching together a life from pieces that had once felt too broken to mend. And every time she spoke one of those names aloud, it was like laying claim to the space around her, not by ownership, but by recognition. She was no longer a girl surviving someone else's war. She was a woman naming what was hers to feel. Because sometimes healing doesn't start with forgiveness or even peace. Sometimes it starts with calling something what it is and letting that be enough. Mercy burned all morning, not hot, not wild, just steady. And when the wind howled later that night, trying to claw its way under the door, the fire stayed lit. The flame didn't waver, neither did she. She wasn't ready to name herself yet, but now, at least, she believed it was something she could one day choose. Later that evening, as the fire settled into a quiet glow, she found herself seated in the small chair they had named Return. It had become her place not because he gave it to her, but because she had chosen it. The cushion was thin, the wood creaked slightly, but it held her without question. He was carving something across the room, a handle for a ladle, maybe, but not once did he glance over to check on her. That absence of surveillance felt more intimate than any touch she had known. She stared at the fire she had lit Mercy and for the first time didn't see herself as the girl who had arrived trembling with her braid undone. She saw someone who could create warmth, someone who could name things, someone who didn't need to be rescued to matter. "Do you think everything deserves a name?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. He paused his carving, looked up. "No," he said after a beat. "But I think everything good should be named before it disappears." She let those words sit between them like an unlit candle. Maybe she wasn't ready to name herself yet, but she was no longer invisible. And sometimes, the slow work of becoming begins not with a scream or a vow, but with a whisper to the fire you started with your own hand. A boy at the window. It was still early when she heard the knock. Not loud, not rushed. Just 3 quiet taps, followed by silence as if whoever stood outside wasn't asking for entry, just permission to be near. Anth froze mid-step, her hand still wrapped around a tin cup. The cabin was warm. Mercy had been lit since dawn, but her body had gone cold. Her breath stopped at the base of her throat. Corbin looked up from the corner where he was mending a strap, eyes meeting hers. He didn't speak. He didn't move. She crossed the room slowly, not with fear, but with something harder to name. Memory. The weight of all the doors she'd been dragged through. The shadows she'd left people in. The one person she had hidden not out of shame, but out of survival. She opened the door, and there he was. A small boy, cheeks red with cold, eyes wide and sharp and waiting. He said nothing. Neither did she. She crouched down, arms open but not too wide, letting him decide. And he did. He walked into her chest like he had never left it, like all the miles she had run hadn't been a separation but a circle, finally closing. "Caleb," she whispered, more breath than sound. Behind her, Corbin stood slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't ask who the boy was. Didn't ask why a woman who had called herself alone now had a child pressing into her coat. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply knelt, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, his movements quiet, steady, unthreatening. "You hungry?" he asked gently. Caleb hesitated, glanced at his mother, then nodded once. Corbin stood and walked back to the hearth, slicing bread with the same rhythm he used for everything: slow, precise, without drama. He poured a cup of warm milk from the kettle and set both on the table. Caleb climbed into the chair without being told, and Anth, still crouched near the door, watched it all with something she hadn't felt in years. Not peace, not safety, recognition. This was what it looked like when a child wasn't a problem to be solved or a mistake to be corrected. This was what it meant to be received without explanation. Caleb chewed slowly, eyes flicking between the fire and the man who had offered it. He didn't speak, but he didn't flinch either. Anth closed the door quietly behind her and walked over. She didn't sit, just stood near the table, hand on the back of the chair Caleb sat in. "He's mine," she said, softly but clearly. Corbin didn't react, just nodded. "I had to send him away," she continued. "Before the auction, I couldn't risk they would have—" Her voice faltered. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Corbin turned from the fire, his eyes meeting hers not with curiosity, but understanding. "You did what you had to do," he said. That was all. No judgment, no interrogation, no demand for more truth than she could carry. She sat down across from Caleb, rested her chin in her hands, and watched him eat. Each bite felt like a miracle, like proof that survival hadn't turned to stone inside him. Later, when Caleb had finished and was curled by the hearth drawing shapes in the ash with a stick, Anth leaned back in her chair and closed her eye. "We're safe now," she said. The words came out before she had time to test them. They didn't wobble. They didn't apologize. It was the first time she'd said those words and believed them. And when she opened her eyes again, Corbin was looking at her, not surprised, not pleased, just present. That was the thing about him. He didn't react like someone who had just learned something. He acted like someone who had always known it was coming and had made peace with its arrival long before the knock. That night, as the fire flickered low and the boy slept on a folded blanket near the hearth, Anth watched them both, one man, one child, neither asking her to be anything more than what she was. And in the stillness, she let herself feel it fully. Not guilt, not fear, not shame, just belonging. Not the kind written into documents or bought at auction, but the kind that sits quietly in your bones and says, "You don't have to run anymore." She tucked the boy's blanket under his chin, smoothed his hair, and kissed his temple. It wasn't an apology. It was a promise. That from this night forward, he would not be hidden, and she would not be small. What she buried in the snow. The snow had softened overnight. Not the harsh, blinding white of a storm, but a gentle hush, thick enough to cover the past, thin enough to remember where it had been. Anth stirred in the dim blue of early morning, long before the fire was lit, before Caleb's breath had changed from sleep to waking. She moved slowly, not to avoid waking them, but because what she was about to do didn't require haste. Some things asked to be done in silence, and only one. From beneath the cot, she pulled the old tin box. Its hinges creaked a little, like bones remembering how to move. Inside lay a scrap of fabric, lilac, threadbare, with a tear at the edge. It no longer smelled like anything, but she remembered the weight of it on her shoulders the day she was sold. It had been the one thing she'd kept not out of sentiment, but as proof that she had survived, that she'd left. But now, it no longer felt like proof. It felt like something she was still carrying without need. She wrapped it carefully in a strip of parchment and stepped outside. The morning air sliced across her skin but did not sting. It was the kind of cold that kept you awake, but not afraid. Snow creaked beneath her boots as she walked around to the back of the cabin, past the firewood, past the trail of bird prints, until she reached the crooked oak behind the house. This tree had survived more winters than she could imagine. Its bark split and nodded with time, a tree that never asked to bloom but kept reaching anyway. Beneath it, she knelt. She dug with her hands, through layers of snow and soil, her breath rising in steady clouds. The ground resisted her, but only gently, as if testing her resolve. When the hole was wide and deep enough, she lowered the fabric in with both hands, not with bitterness, not in grief, but with a strange kind of reverence. She didn't know if she was burying a memory or a version of herself. maybe both. She pressed the earth back down slowly, palms flat, sealing it like a story she no longer had to tell. There were no tears, no speeches, only stillness. And when she looked up, Corbin was standing at a distance, on the porch, watching, not intruding. Just there. She didn't wave. He didn't nod. But something passed between them, something quiet and enormous. Understanding, perhaps, or grace. That evening, when she came back inside, the fire was already lit, earlier than usual. Its warmth struck her first. Then its smell, sharp pine, soft birch, something almost sweet. He didn't mention it, didn't say a word about where she'd gone, what she'd done. He simply handed her a cup of tea and went back to carving. Later that night, long after Caleb had fallen asleep with his head in her lap, she spoke, not to break the silence, but to give shape to it. "I don't belong to anyone," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't an apology. It was a truth laid bare, like wood stripped of paint. Corbin didn't reply. She ran a hand through Caleb's hair. "But if I could choose," she continued, softer now, "I'd choose this." She didn't name the cabin, or the man beside her, or the fire. She didn't have to. She had already named mercy, grace, and return. This part didn't need a label. It only needed to be lived. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, slow, without hurry. And beneath it, under the roots of the old oak, the last piece of the girl she once was rested quietly in the earth. Not gone, not forgotten, but no longer needed. And in her place, a woman sat in the firelight, holding a sleeping child and a life that no longer had to be earned, only accepted. She remained still long after the fire had settled into soft embers, the orange glow casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Caleb stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before turning to press closer into her side. She adjusted the blanket over him, her fingers now steady, her breath no longer shallow. Corbin hadn't spoken a word since her return from the oak. He didn't need to. He just moved through the cabin with the same quiet certainty he always had, stacking wood, mending the torn strap of her boot, preparing the stew that simmered low and gentle. But something about the space between them had shifted. Not smaller, not closer, just clearer. She watched him now from across the room, the firelight flickering against his jaw, against the lines time had carved into his face. He looked up, met her eyes, and in that moment, no history needed unpacking. No shame required retelling. Tomorrow would come with more snow, more silence, more small rituals. But tonight, the woman who once belonged to no one had buried her past and lit her own fire, and that was enough, more than enough. Not a bride, but a place to stand. It was Anth who knocked first, not timidly, not as a guest. Just two clear knocks on the wooden frame of his door, the kind that said, "I'm not asking to be let in, I'm asking to begin." Corbin looked up from where he was sorting rope and iron hooks. She stood there, wrapped in her coat, her braid tucked behind one ear, the same braid he'd once tied with trembling fingers, now bound by her own hand. "Could you teach me to split wood?" she asked. He didn't blink, didn't smile. "Sure," he said simply. Outside, the snow had thinned. Patches of brown grass peeked through like shy promises. The air still bit, but the sun had the weight of spring in it, quiet, slow coming, but real. He handed her the smaller axe, not the dulled one meant for guests or chores, but the one he used himself. She tested its weight, nodded. No ceremony, just readiness. They worked side by side in silence. No lessons, no correction, just rhythm. He split one log. She followed. He stacked. She stacked. And slowly, the sound of wood cracking open filled the quiet like percussion, intentional, grounded, alive. Sweat bloomed at her temples. Her muscles ached, not from weakness, but from awakening. Each swing of the axe felt like a word she hadn't been allowed to speak. And now, with each strike, she spoke it. "I'm still here. I choose this." By midday, her braid had come loose. She pulled it out entirely and tucked the ribbon into her coat pocket. Later that afternoon, as he fixed a shutter that rattled in the wind, She went inside. From the shelf above her cot, she took the old cartridge box once used to hold bullets and opened it. Inside, she placed her braid, not like a relic, but like something no longer needed in battle. She didn't lock it, she didn't hide it, just closed the lid and left it on the table where anyone could see. That night, the three of them shared stew and cornbread. Caleb insisted on helping, his hands sticky with flour, his laughter spilling into corners that had once held silent. Corbin passed her a bowl, and without thinking, she said, "Ours always tastes better." He raised an eyebrow. "Ours?" She didn't flinch. "House stew. Ours." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a decision. It was the simple truth of a life lived in small, deliberate moments. There was no ring, no vow, no asking or offering, just the quiet understanding that when you've been claimed too many times against your will, the most powerful thing is not to be chosen but to choose. And she had. She had chosen to knock, to swing the axe, to place her braid in a box not as surrender but as release, to say ours and mean mine too. In that moment, she was not a bride. She was not a kept thing. She was not a story passed from man to man. She was her own beginning. And in the eyes of the man across the table who had never asked for her name, her past, or her body, she saw something better than love. She saw respect. The kind that didn't need to be spoken to be known. The kind that made a woman want to stay not because she had to, but because she could. After supper, Caleb fell asleep by the hearth again, his arms wrapped around the old broom they'd once named Grace. Anth stood by the window, watching snow settle on the sill, softer now, like the land had decided to rest too. Behind her, Corbin cleared the table without a word. They moved like people who'd lived a long time in silence, not out of discomfort, but understanding. She turned to him then. "You know I'm not your bride," she said. He looked at her, steady. "I know." She stepped closer, slow but sure. "But I'm not running." He nodded, set down the bowl in his hand. "I never asked you to stay." She smiled, just a little. "That's why I did." In that moment, they didn't need a fire to feel warm. The room was full, not with heat, but with something quieter, a stillness that hummed with choice, not fate, with freedom, not debt. She took a breath, long and full, and for the first time it didn't catch in her chest. It didn't feel borrowed. It felt hers. She was never just bought. Each morning now begins with the same question, soft and sure as sunlight warming the cabin floor. "Has the fire gotten a new name, Mama?" Caleb asks it with a grin full of crumbs and sleep, curled beneath the same blanket he once clung to like armor. His voice carries no fear, only curiosity, the kind that grows where wounds have stopped bleeding. And each night, before the sky turns indigo, Corbin lights the fire early, not because it's cold, not because anyone asks, but because it's become a quiet promise. This home will always be warm before darkness comes. There is no ceremony to their days, no titles spoken, no roles enforced. Yet everything has changed. The woman who once counted her steps toward survival now walks without measuring. She ties her hair as she pleases. She laughs when the stew boils over. She kisses her son goodnight without flinching at the creak of the door. And one day, without warning, she sees herself in the small, clouded mirror above the basin, not as someone bought, not as someone saved, but as someone returned to herself. A mother, a woman, a life unclaimed by anyone but her. She smiles not for anyone to see, but because it feels good to do so. Because healing, when it comes quietly and stays long enough, stops looking like a fight and starts feeling like home. She was sold like a possession, but she was never owned. Because sometimes healing doesn't come through rescue. It comes through silence, respect, and the space to choose your own ending. This wasn't a story about falling in love. It was about standing on your own 2 feet and being met by someone who doesn't try to carry you, but walks beside you. So tell us, which moment in this story surprised you the most? What truth or lesson will you carry from it? Comment below, we read every one. And if this story stirred something in you, please like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. It helps us bring more forgotten voices into the light. Now as the fire fades and the snow falls soft outside that little wooden cabin, ask yourself, what would you bury if you knew you were finally safe?